He turned slowly toward Obina and Adana. "Do you know who this young man truly was?" he asked painfully. The couple stared at him in confusion and terror. "This is your son," the king announced. The entire village became silent like a graveyard. Adana shook her head violently while Obina collapsed to the ground.
In the ancient village of Umuoka, where red earth roads twisted between mud houses and tall palm trees, there lived a poor couple named Adana and Obina. Their lives were simple, but their love for their only child was deeper than the river behind the king's palace. Their son was named Chinedu. He was 12 years old, bright-eyed and full of laughter. The villagers loved him dearly because he carried joy everywhere he went. Every morning before sunrise, Chinedu ran through the village carrying firewood on his head while singing old folk songs his mother taught him. Even angry men smiled whenever they saw him. The elders often said the boy carried light inside his spirit. Adana believed her son was the greatest blessing God had given her. Obina dreamed of the day Chinedu would grow into a respected man. But fate was quietly preparing darkness for the peaceful family. One busy market day, the village square overflowed with traders, dancers, drummers, and strangers from distant lands. Adana sold roasted yams beside the road while Obina repaired baskets under a large mango tree. Chinedu wandered happily around the market, fascinated by colorful fabrics and sweet smells drifting through the air. Unknown to the family, 3 dangerous men had entered the village pretending to be travelers. The strangers watched Chinedu carefully from a distance like hungry hawks observing prey. As evening approached, dark clouds gathered above the village. Adana asked her son to fetch water from the stream behind the forest before the rain began. Chinedu grabbed his clay pot and hurried away happily, unaware that evil footsteps followed behind him through the bushes. Halfway to the stream, rough hands suddenly grabbed him from behind. A cloth covered his mouth before he could scream properly. Chinedu kicked wildly and struggled with all his strength, but the kidnappers were too powerful. They dragged him deep into the forest while thunder roared above the trees. Soon the boy disappeared completely into the darkness. When night fell and Chinedu failed to return home, fear entered Adana's heart immediately. She searched the roads calling his name again and again. Obina joined the search while villagers carried lanterns into the forest. Hunters followed footprints through muddy paths until dawn, but no trace of the boy could be found. The entire village became filled with panic and sorrow. Adana's scream shook Umuoka when she realized her son was truly gone. The king ordered drummers to announce the disappearance in nearby villages. Messengers traveled from town to town searching for information. Days passed without news. Weeks turned into months, and slowly hope began to die inside the village. Years passed painfully for the grieving parents. Adana stopped singing completely. Obina became quieter with each passing season. Their once joyful home turned silent like a graveyard. Some villagers whispered that Chinedu was probably dead. Others believed he had been sold far away across the river. But Adana never stopped praying for her child's return. Meanwhile, far from Umuoka, Chinedu suffered terribly in captivity. The kidnappers sold him to a cruel man in a distant town where children worked like slaves. He carried heavy loads from sunrise until midnight every day. Whenever he made small mistakes, he was beaten mercilessly. At night he cried silently while remembering his parents and peaceful village life. The memories became the only thing keeping him alive. He remembered his mother's warm voice singing folk songs beside the fire. He remembered helping his father weave baskets outside their hut. He remembered laughter in the village square during moonlight dances. Every memory cut deeply into his heart, yet it also gave him strength to survive. One stormy night after 3 terrible years in captivity, Chinedu finally escaped. Rain poured heavily while thunder cracked across the sky. The guards became drunk on palm wine and fell asleep carelessly inside their hut. Chinedu climbed through a broken fence barefoot and disappeared into the darkness without looking back once. For days he wandered through forests and crossed dangerous rivers alone. He survived on wild fruits and dirty stream water. Sometimes he hid beneath abandoned farm sheds to escape strangers. Several times he almost died from hunger and exhaustion. Yet something inside him refused to give up completely. Eventually, the exhausted boy reached a giant city unlike anything he had ever imagined. Tall buildings touched the sky while traders shouted in strange languages. Crowded streets overflowed with carts, animals, and endless noise. For the first time in years, Chinedu felt both terrified and free at the same time. Life in the city was extremely difficult at first. He slept beneath bridges and begged strangers for leftover food. Sometimes he polished shoes for coins. Other days he carried heavy loads in crowded markets from morning until evening. Many people cheated him or insulted him because he was poor and alone. Please like this video and subscribe to our channel to support us, also not to miss our next video. But one old mechanic named Boba Soul eventually took pity on the struggling boy. The old man taught Chinedu how to repair machines and engines carefully. Chinedu learned quickly because he was hardworking and determined. He worked harder than anyone else because he understood the pain of hunger and suffering better than most people. Years rolled by slowly, and Chinedu transformed into a strong young man. By the age of 24, he owned a successful transport business in the city. Many workers respected him because he treated people honestly and fairly. He helped poor street children often because he never forgot his painful childhood. Despite his success, one wound remained inside his heart. He still did not know where he truly belonged. His memories of Umoka had faded with time. He remembered faces and songs, but many roads and places were no longer clear in his mind. Still, something inside him constantly whispered that he must return home one day. One evening while watching the sunset from his balcony, Chinedu finally made his decision. He packed expensive gifts, beautiful clothes, and a large leather bag filled with money. He planned to help the family he hoped was still alive somewhere. His workers begged him to travel with guards, but he refused calmly. The journey back lasted many days and nights. Chinedu traveled from village to village asking old people questions about his childhood memories. Slowly, forgotten details began returning to his mind. He remembered a river, a giant Iroko tree, and a red mountain near his village. Finally, one elderly traveler recognized the description immediately. "You are speaking about Umoka," the old traveler told him quietly. The moment Chinedu heard the village name, tears filled his eyes instantly. His heart pounded wildly as he continued the journey toward home. At sunset he finally arrived near the village entrance. Everything looked both familiar and strange at the same time. Children played near the square while women carried firewood along dusty roads. As Chinedu walked through Umoka, memories flooded his heart painfully. Yet he could not remember exactly where his parents' house stood anymore. Many years had passed, and many buildings had changed completely. Unsure of what to do next, he decided to visit the king's palace first before nightfall arrived. King Izudo was now an old man, but he still ruled the village wisely. He listened carefully as Chinedu explained his painful story from beginning to end. The king became thoughtful after hearing the young man's childhood name. He remembered the heartbreaking disappearance of a little boy many years earlier. "It is already late," the king said gently after a long silence. "You cannot wander through the village at night searching for people. Tomorrow morning we shall gather the elders and discover the truth together. For tonight, I will ask a family to shelter you." Chinedu bowed respectfully and thanked the king sincerely. The king instructed his guards to take the visitor to a nearby home for the night. Fate laughed silently at that moment because the guards unknowingly chose the house belonging to Obina and Adana. The same parents who had spent 12 painful years mourning their missing child were now preparing to host him. When Chinedu entered the compound, Adana felt something strange immediately. She could not explain why the young man's face touched her heart deeply. Obina also stared at him longer than necessary. Yet neither parent recognized the child they had lost years ago because time had changed him completely. During dinner, the family spoke very little. Chinedu thanked them politely for their kindness and mentioned he would meet the king again in the morning. As he opened his leather bag briefly to remove clothes, bundles of money became visible inside. Adana froze instantly while Obina's eyes widened with shock. The amount of money inside the bag was greater than anything the poor couple had ever seen before. Years of suffering and poverty had hardened their hearts badly. Their crops had failed repeatedly, and debt swallowed almost everything they owned. Suddenly temptation entered their minds like poison. After Chinedu went to sleep in the guest room, silence filled the house heavily. Then Obina spoke quietly to his wife. "That money could change our lives forever," he whispered. Adana looked horrified by the suggestion immediately. She reminded him that the young man was only an innocent guest. But greed slowly clouded Obina's mind completely. "Nobody will know," he argued bitterly. "Travelers disappear all the time." Adana trembled while fighting against the terrible idea. Yet she also imagined how the money could rebuild their lives and erase years of painful suffering. Outside the hut, thunder rumbled across the dark night sky. Inside, husband and wife battled their consciences silently for hours. Finally, desperation defeated their humanity. Obina grabbed his machete with shaking hands while Adana began crying softly. Together they walked slowly toward the guest room where Chinedu slept peacefully. Chinedu never suspected danger inside the home. He never imagined death waited in the hands of his own parents. Obina stood over the sleeping young man while his hands trembled violently. Something about the stranger's face looked painfully familiar for a brief moment. But greed blinded his thoughts completely. Adana whispered nervously, "Do it quickly before dawn comes." Obina raised the machete slowly into the air. Then suddenly he struck. Chinedu woke with a scream as blood stained the sleeping mat. His terrified eyes searched desperately through the darkness. "Why?" he whispered weakly. Another brutal strike silenced him forever. The room became horrifyingly quiet except for Adana's uncontrollable crying. The couple buried the body secretly behind their house before sunrise. They washed the blood stains carefully and pretended nothing had happened. But evil can never hide forever. Early the next morning, palace guards arrived to bring the visitor back to the king's palace immediately. The visitor left before dawn, Obina lied nervously. The guards became suspicious at once. One noticed disturbed soil behind the house while another saw poorly cleaned blood stains near the doorway. Within minutes, panic spread through the compound. The guards dug into the soft earth and uncovered Chinedu's lifeless body beneath the soil. Adana collapsed screaming while Obina attempted to run away. Villagers rushed toward the compound as news spread rapidly across Umuaka. Soon the entire village gathered around the terrible scene in complete horror. The king himself arrived shortly afterward with trembling steps. As the king stared at Chinedu's body, his eyes suddenly noticed a small wooden bracelet nearby. He picked it up slowly and turned it over carefully. Then his face changed completely. Years earlier, Adana had proudly shown the village this same bracelet after carving her son's name beneath it. The king's hands trembled violently as he read the faded inscription. Chinedu. Tears filled the old king's eyes instantly. He turned slowly toward Obina and Adana. "Do you know who this young man truly was?" he asked painfully. The couple stared at him in confusion and terror. "This is your son," the king announced. The entire village became silent like a graveyard. Adana shook her head violently while Obina collapsed to the ground. The king explained everything through tears. Chinedu had escaped from kidnappers years ago, built a successful life in the city, and finally returned home searching for his family. Adana crawled desperately toward the lifeless body, screaming uncontrollably. "My son! My son!" she cried while holding his cold face. Obina beat his chest and begged God for forgiveness repeatedly. The villagers themselves began weeping openly because the tragedy was too terrible to imagine. After praying for their child's return for 12 long years, they had murdered him with their own hands because of greed. The king ordered both parents arrested immediately and taken to the police station in the neighboring town. Even the officers became emotional after hearing the heartbreaking story. Inside prison, Adana refused food for many days. She spent every night crying while remembering her son's final moments. Obina's hair turned almost completely white within weeks. Both parents replayed the terrible night repeatedly in their minds, realizing all the signs they ignored because greed had blinded them. Weeks later, Chinedu received a proper burial beneath the giant Iroko tree near the village square. Thousands attended the funeral while sorrow covered Umuaka completely. The king himself placed flowers beside the grave and spoke through tears about the young man who survived kidnappers only to die in his parents' hands. Months later, Adana died inside prison whispering her son's name repeatedly. Obina broke completely after hearing the news of his wife's death. 3 days later, he too passed away quietly in his sleep. Many villagers believed their hearts could no longer carry the unbearable weight of guilt and sorrow. Years later, elders still told the tragic story of Chinedu during moonlight gatherings. Parents used the tale to teach children never to allow greed to control their hearts. Travelers who visited Umuaka often stood silently beside the young man's grave beneath the Iroko tree. And whenever the wind blew softly through the village at night, some people claimed it sounded like a young boy singing sadly in the darkness. Not with anger. Not with revenge. But with the sorrow of a child who finally found his parents too late.